Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1897 in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia carried an unusual chill that seemed to settle deep into the bones of anyone who ventured through Greenbrier Valley. The mountain folk of Pocahontas County had always lived with the understanding that these ancient hills held secrets, but none could have imagined the darkness that would soon emerge from the depths of Widow's Hollow, a narrow gorge carved by centuries of mountain runoff approximately 12 miles southeast of the settlement of Marlinton. The hollow had earned its name long before the events that would make it infamous. Local records from the Pocahontas County Courthouse, dating back to 1855, reference the area as unsuitable for settlement due to treacherous terrain and unstable limestone formations. The name itself was derived from the narrow passage that wound through towering rock walls, creating a sense of enclosure so complete that even during midday, the floor of the hollow remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. It was here, in this forgotten corner of the mountains, that Cordelia Ashworth made her home after the death of her husband Matthias in the winter of 1895. The couple had originally settled in a modest farmstead 3 miles closer to town, but following Matthias's sudden death from what the local physician Dr. Jeremiah Holloway described as acute respiratory failure of unknown origin, Cordelia made the peculiar decision to relocate to the abandoned cabin that had belonged to Matthias's deceased brother, Barnabas Ashworth. Barnabas had been something of an outcast in the community, known for his reclusive nature and his obsession with the limestone caves that honeycombed the mountainside behind his property. According to local oral histories collected decades later, Barnabas had spent the final years of his life exploring and mapping the extensive cave system, claiming he was conducting geological research for a mining company that no one in town had ever heard of. When he was found dead in his cabin in 1893, apparently of natural causes, his extensive notes and cave maps disappeared, presumably taken by Cordelia when she later claimed the property. The cabin itself was a modest structure, built of local stone and timber, with 2 main rooms and a root cellar that had been excavated directly into the limestone bedrock. What made the property unusual was its proximity to the mouth of what locals called Ashworth's Cave, a limestone cavern that opened like a gaping wound in the mountainside approximately 50 yards behind the cabin. The cave entrance was large enough for a person to walk through upright, but it curved sharply to the left within 30 feet, disappearing into absolute darkness. Cordelia's decision to relocate to such an isolated location raised eyebrows among the residents of Marlinton, but mountain folk had always respected a person's right to grieve in their own way. At 38 years of age, she was considered past the age when remarriage was likely, and without heirs to continue the family name, her choice to live alone was viewed as unfortunate, but not entirely surprising. What was surprising, however, was how quickly Cordelia seemed to adapt to her new circumstances. According to Ezekiel Crane, who operated a small general store in Marlinton and kept detailed records of his customers' purchasing habits, Cordelia made her first visit to town exactly 1 week after moving to the hollow. She purchased basic provisions, flour, salt, preserves, and lamp oil, but also made several unusual requests that Crane noted in his ledger with apparent confusion. Crane's records, discovered during a 1962 renovation of the building that once housed his store, show that Cordelia specifically inquired about purchasing large quantities of quicklime, which was used for preserving organic matter and neutralizing odors. When Crane explained that he typically only stocked small quantities for household use, Cordelia arranged to have several sacks delivered directly to her cabin. She also purchased an unusual amount of heavy canvas tarpaulins, rope, and what Crane described in his notes as mining equipment suitable for cave work. The local postmaster, Tobias Garner, later recalled that Cordelia began receiving regular correspondence from addresses in Charleston and Wheeling, West Virginia, as well as from Richmond, Virginia. The letters arrived with unusual frequency, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single week, and were always addressed in the same neat handwriting. When asked years later to describe anything unusual about these letters, Garner mentioned that they often carried an odd, musty smell, as if they had been stored in a damp place before being mailed. As autumn progressed into the harsh mountain winter of 1897, Cordelia's visits to town became increasingly infrequent. According to the records kept by the Marlinton Methodist Church, where attendance was carefully documented, Cordelia attended services regularly through October, but failed to appear for the Harvest Festival in early November. Reverend Marcus Whitmore noted in his weekly diary that several parishioners had expressed concern about the widow's welfare, particularly given her isolated living situation and the early onset of what would prove to be one of the most severe winters in recent memory. The Reverend's diaries, preserved in the West Virginia Historical Society archives, provide valuable insight into the community's growing unease about Cordelia's situation. In an entry dated November 18, 1897, Reverend Whitmore wrote, "Mrs. Ashworth's absence from divine services has become a matter of considerable concern among the congregation. Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, my dear wife, has attempted twice to visit the widow in her mountain retreat, but has been unable to locate the cabin in the maze of logging trails that crisscross Widow's Hollow. I have resolved to organize a proper expedition to check on her welfare before the heavy snows make passage impossible." However, this expedition was delayed by an early blizzard that struck the region on November 22nd, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow across the mountain passes and making travel treacherous for several weeks. It would not be until the spring thaw of 1898 that anyone from the community would successfully reach Cordelia's cabin, and by then it would be too late to understand what had transpired during those long winter months. The first hint that something was terribly wrong came in March of 1898, when melting snow began to expose debris that had washed down from the upper reaches of Widow's Hollow. Jeremiah Blackwood, a local trapper who regularly checked his lines along the creek that ran through the hollow, discovered several disturbing items caught in a beaver dam approximately 2 miles downstream from Cordelia's cabin. Among the debris were pieces of heavy canvas tarpaulin torn and stained with what appeared to be old blood, several lengths of rope that had been cut or chewed through, and, most disturbingly, fragments of human clothing that Blackwood recognized as belonging to travelers who had passed through the area during the previous autumn. Blackwood immediately reported his discoveries to the county sheriff, Amos Crawford, who assembled a small posse to investigate. Sheriff Crawford's official report, filed with the county courthouse on March 15, 1898, provides a detailed account of what the search party discovered upon reaching Cordelia's cabin. The structure itself appeared undamaged by the harsh winter, with smoke still rising from the chimney, indicating recent habitation. However, the area around the cabin showed signs of considerable activity that seemed inconsistent with the presence of a single occupant. The ground behind the cabin, in the area between the structure and the cave mouth, was heavily disturbed despite the recent snow cover. Crawford's report describes numerous areas where the earth appears to have been excavated and refilled, creating an irregular pattern of mounds and depressions extending from the cabin to the cave entrance. More concerning were the deep grooves in the ground that suggested heavy objects had been dragged repeatedly along the same path. When the posse approached the cabin, they found Cordelia seated in a rocking chair on the front porch, apparently waiting for their arrival. Crawford's description of her appearance suggests that the winter had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental condition. Her hair, which had been described as auburn when she first arrived in the hollow, had turned completely white. Her weight had dropped dramatically, giving her face a gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance that several members of the posse later described as corpse-like. Most unsettling was her demeanor during the initial questioning. According to Crawford's report, Cordelia appeared to be in a state of extreme agitation, frequently glancing toward the cave entrance and muttering under her breath in what sounded like conversations with invisible companions. When asked about her welfare and whether she needed assistance, she responded that she had been keeping busy with important work, and that the cave requires constant attention. When Crawford requested permission to examine the cave, Cordelia became visibly distressed, insisting that the cave was not ready for visitors and that she needed more time to complete her arrangements. However, legal authority in such matters rested with the sheriff, and Crawford proceeded with his investigation despite her objections. The cave entrance revealed evidence of extensive modification since Cordelia had taken residence. Heavy wooden beams had been installed to reinforce the natural limestone arch, and a system of pulleys and ropes had been constructed that appeared designed for moving heavy objects into and out of the cave. The limestone floor near the entrance showed wear patterns consistent with frequent traffic, and the walls bore torch scars indicating regular illumination. Approximately 30 feet into the cave, where the passage curved sharply to the left, Crawford's party made their first disturbing discovery. The natural cave floor had been systematically excavated, creating a series of rectangular depressions, each roughly the size and shape of a human grave. The excavations were lined with the heavy canvas tarpaulins that Cordelia had purchased from Crane's store, and each depression showed evidence of recent use. More horrifying was the discovery of personal effects scattered throughout this section of the cave. Crawford's inventory, documented in painful detail, included clothing, shoes, jewelry, and personal documents belonging to at least 7 different individuals. Among these items were the papers of Hiram McIntosh, a traveling tinker, who had disappeared while passing through the area in October, the distinctive brass buttons from the coat worn by Samuel Hendricks, a merchant from Lewisburg who had vanished in November, and the wedding ring of Martha Copeland, an elderly woman who had been traveling to visit family in Pocahontas County and had never arrived at her destination. The deeper sections of the cave revealed evidence of even more systematic activity. Natural chambers had been connected by excavated passages, creating a network of underground spaces that extended far beyond what the original cave system would have naturally provided. The limestone walls bore tool marks indicating months of careful excavation, and several chambers contained stockpiles of the quicklime that Cordelia had purchased, arranged in neat rows like supplies in a warehouse. In the deepest accessible chamber, approximately 200 feet from the cave entrance, Crawford's party discovered what appeared to be Cordelia's workshop. Crude tables had been constructed from limestone slabs, and these surfaces bore stains and tool marks that suggested they had been used for butchering activities. Several large metal tubs, apparently salvaged from the abandoned mining operations that had once been common in the area, contained residues that gave off a powerful odor of decay despite the application of large quantities of quicklime. Most disturbing were the detailed records that Cordelia had maintained throughout the winter. Written in her careful handwriting on pages torn from account ledgers, these documents cataloged each visitor to her cabin with meticulous attention to detail. Each entry included the person's name, age, approximate weight, the date of their arrival, and notes about their ultimate disposition that were rendered in a clinical, businesslike tone that suggested complete detachment from the reality of what these records actually documented. The final entry in these records was dated March 10, 1898, 5 days before Crawford's arrival. It simply read, "Preparations complete, final arrangements made, account settled in full." When confronted with this evidence, Cordelia's response was both chilling and incomprehensible. According to Crawford's report, she explained that she had been fulfilling a contract that her late husband Matthias had made before his death. She claimed that Matthias had received correspondence from business associates who required certain services that could only be provided in complete isolation. The cave, with its natural preservation properties and complete concealment from outside observation, had been ideal for this purpose. Cordelia maintained that she was simply completing work that Matthias had begun, and that she had been compensated through the regular mail deliveries that Garner had observed. When pressed for details about the nature of this work, she became increasingly agitated, insisting that her clients had very specific requirements that she was contractually obligated to fulfill. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy of horrifying scope. The correspondence that Cordelia had been receiving was traced to several funeral homes and medical schools in Charleston, Wheeling, and Richmond. These establishments, it emerged, had been paying substantial sums for the delivery of fresh human remains for anatomical study and embalming experimentation. At a time when medical science was advancing rapidly, the demand for anatomical specimens far exceeded the legal supply, creating a lucrative black market for human remains. Matthias, it appeared, had established himself as a supplier in this underground economy, using the isolated cave system to process and preserve remains before shipping them to his customers. His sudden death had left Cordelia with knowledge of his activities and a financial incentive to continue them. The isolated location of the cabin, combined with the natural concealment provided by the cave, had allowed her to expand the operation far beyond what Matthias had originally envisioned. Rather than simply supplying existing remains, Cordelia had begun creating inventory by targeting travelers who passed through the isolated mountain roads. The harsh winter had provided perfect cover for her activities, as disappearances could be easily attributed to the treacherous conditions and the danger of becoming lost in blizzards. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the remote location of the crimes and the limited law enforcement resources available in Pocahontas County. Cordelia was arrested and held in the county jail in Marlinton, while authorities attempted to identify all of the victims and trace the network of customers who had been receiving the remains. However, the case would never come to trial. On the night of March 28, 1898, exactly 13 days after her arrest, Cordelia was found dead in her cell. According to Dr. Holloway's official report, she appeared to have died of natural causes related to the extreme physical and mental stress of the preceding months. However, several details about her death remained unexplained. The jailkeeper, Samuel Thornton, reported that throughout her incarceration, Cordelia had maintained that she was expecting one final delivery and that she needed to return to the cave to complete her obligations. On the night of her death, Thornton heard her speaking animatedly with someone in her cell, carrying on what sounded like a detailed business conversation. When he investigated, he found her alone, apparently talking to the wall. More puzzling was a letter found in Cordelia's cell after her death. Written in her familiar handwriting, it was addressed to an unnamed recipient and contained detailed instructions for locating and accessing the cave system. The letter concluded with the cryptic statement, "The work must continue. The cave remembers everything. Someone will understand." The cave itself was sealed by order of Sheriff Crawford, who had heavy timber barriers installed across the entrance and posted warnings declaring the area dangerous and off-limits to the public. However, these measures proved insufficient to keep curious locals away from the site. Throughout the summer of 1898, residents of Widow's Hollow reported strange activities around the sealed cave, sounds of digging and construction work during the night hours, and occasional sightings of individuals carrying lanterns near the entrance. Dr. Silas Pemberton, a professor of geology at West Virginia University, who had become interested in the case through newspaper reports, received permission from county authorities to conduct a scientific examination of the cave in September 1898. Pemberton's initial survey was intended to determine whether the site posed any ongoing public health hazards and to document the extent of the modifications that had been made to the natural cave system. What Pemberton discovered during his investigation exceeded anything that had been documented in the original sheriff's reports. The cave system extended far deeper into the mountain than anyone had previously realized, with excavated passages connecting natural chambers across a distance of nearly half a mile. Several chambers contained evidence of recent activity that post-dated Cordelia's death by several months, including fresh tool marks on the walls and recently installed wooden supports. Most disturbing was Pemberton's discovery of a fully equipped underground workshop in one of the deepest chambers. Unlike the crude tables and equipment found near the entrance, this facility appeared to have been constructed with considerable skill and investment. Metal tables with drainage systems had been installed, along with a complex system of pipes and reservoirs that provided running water from an underground spring. Chemical supplies were neatly organized on shelves, and a collection of surgical instruments and anatomical texts suggested that whoever was operating this facility possessed considerable medical knowledge. Pemberton's field notes, preserved in the university archives, document his growing realization that he was not alone in the cave system. On his third day of exploration, he noted hearing sounds of activity from deeper chambers that ceased abruptly when he approached. Tool marks on the walls appeared fresh, and he found evidence that several chambers had been recently cleaned and reorganized. On the final day of his planned survey, Pemberton made direct contact with the cave's current occupants. Working alone in one of the upper chambers, he was approached by a man who introduced himself as Dr. Aldrich Mortensen, claiming to be a physician from Baltimore who had come to West Virginia to continue the anatomical research that had been interrupted by Cordelia's arrest. Mortensen explained that the cave represented a significant investment in specialized equipment and infrastructure that could not be easily relocated. He and several colleagues, he claimed, had arrangements with medical schools and research institutions that required a steady supply of anatomical specimens. The isolated location and natural preservation properties of the cave made it an ideal facility for their work, and they intended to continue operations regardless of local legal concerns. Pemberton's notes suggest that he was initially inclined to report this conversation to authorities, but Mortensen presented him with several university documents and letters of introduction that appeared to legitimize his activities. Moreover, Mortensen offered Pemberton substantial compensation for his cooperation in maintaining the secrecy of the operation, along with access to anatomical specimens that would be valuable for his own geological research. The exact nature of the arrangement that Pemberton made with Mortensen was never fully documented, but university records show that Pemberton suddenly received a significant research grant in late 1898 that allowed him to expand his geological surveys throughout the Appalachian region. His subsequent publications on limestone cave systems included detailed anatomical illustrations that were remarkably accurate and sophisticated for the time period. Over the next several years, reports of unusual activities in Widow's Hollow continued to reach local authorities, but these reports were generally dismissed as folklore or mistaken observations. The remote location of the cave made regular surveillance impractical, and county officials were reluctant to invest resources in monitoring an area that appeared to pose no immediate threat to public safety. However, the situation changed dramatically in the spring of 1902, when a group of Methodist missionaries passing through the area discovered evidence of fresh graves in the forest surrounding the cave site. Unlike the shallow depressions that had been found in the cave itself, these appeared to be formal burial sites, marked with crude wooden crosses and arranged in neat rows like a proper cemetery. Reverend Whitmore, who had maintained an interest in the case since Cordelia's arrest, organized a volunteer expedition to examine these burial sites. What they discovered suggested that the activities in the cave had expanded far beyond what anyone had previously imagined. The forest cemetery contained at least 30 marked graves, each with a wooden marker bearing only a number and date. The dates ranged from 1899 to early 1902, indicating that operations had continued and intensified since Pemberton's survey. More disturbing was the discovery of a small building that had been constructed in a clearing approximately a quarter-mile from the cave entrance. Built to resemble a rustic mountain cabin, the structure actually served as a receiving station where victims could be temporarily housed before being processed in the cave facility. The building contained restraining equipment, medical supplies, and detailed records documenting the processing of dozens of individuals over a 3-year period. These records revealed the true scope of what had become a sophisticated commercial operation. Victims were being recruited from urban areas through false employment opportunities, promises of medical treatment, or simple kidnapping. They were transported to the mountain facility where they were processed according to the specific requirements of various customers. The operation had grown to include multiple physicians, embalmers, and support staff who lived in temporary camps scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The investigation that followed involved federal authorities for the first time, as evidence emerged that the operation had been acquiring victims from multiple states. U.S. Marshal Henry Caldwell led a coordinated raid on the facility in June 1902, arresting 7 individuals and seizing extensive documentation of the criminal network. However, the raid was only partially successful. Several key figures, including Dr. Mortensen, managed to escape into the deep cave system before authorities could apprehend them. Efforts to pursue them into the underground passages were abandoned after 2 federal agents became lost in the maze of tunnels and had to be rescued after 3 days underground. The cave was permanently sealed with dynamite charges that collapsed the main passages, but federal investigators suspected that alternative entrances allowed the core group to continue operating from deeper chambers. Reports of unusual activities in the area continued for several more years, gradually diminishing in frequency, but never completely ceasing. Dr. Pemberton's involvement in these events was never publicly revealed, but university records show that his research career ended abruptly in 1902. His personal papers, donated to the university archives upon his death in 1924, include a confession letter dated 1903 in which he detailed his cooperation with the cave operation and expressed profound regret for his role in enabling the crimes that followed. According to this confession, Pemberton had initially believed that he was participating in legitimate medical research, but gradually realized that the operation was acquiring subjects through murder rather than using naturally deceased individuals. By the time he understood the true nature of the activities, he had become so deeply implicated that he feared prosecution if he attempted to report the crimes. The substantial payments he received for his cooperation had been used to support his elderly parents and fund his sister's medical education, creating financial obligations that made it difficult for him to withdraw from the arrangement. Pemberton's confession also revealed additional details about the scope of the operation. According to his account, the cave facility was only one component of a network that included similar installations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Victims were transported between facilities according to customer requirements, and the operation included skilled embalmers who could preserve remains for extended periods and prepare them according to very specific anatomical specifications. The confession concluded with Pemberton's description of his final visit to the cave in late 1901, when he discovered that the operation had evolved beyond simple supply of anatomical specimens. Some customers, he learned, were requesting live subjects for experimental medical procedures, and the cave facility had been modified to accommodate these requirements. Unable to reconcile his continued involvement with such activities, Pemberton had finally severed all contact with the operation, but remained haunted by his knowledge of crimes that he felt powerless to report. The true extent of the cave operation was never fully determined, as many of the records were destroyed when the facility was abandoned. Federal investigators estimated that at least 100 individuals had been processed through the facility during its 4 years of operation, but the actual number may have been considerably higher. Efforts to identify victims were complicated by the fact that many had been transients or individuals whose disappearances would not have been immediately reported to authorities. Local residents continued to report unusual phenomena in Widow's Hollow for decades after the cave was sealed. These reports typically involve sounds of underground activity, occasional sightings of lights moving through the forest at night, and the discovery of items that appeared to have been recently placed despite the area's supposed abandonment. In 1923, a forest fire that swept through the region exposed several previously unknown burial sites in the area surrounding the original cave location. Authorities who investigated these discoveries found evidence suggesting that they were much more recent than the graves documented in 1902, leading to speculation that remnants of the original operation might have continued working from alternative locations. However, no conclusive evidence was ever found to support these theories, and interest in the case gradually diminished as the original participants died and local memories faded. The area was eventually incorporated into the Monongahela National Forest, and access was restricted to researchers and authorized personnel. Dr. Miranda Holbrook, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Virginia, obtained permission to conduct a comprehensive survey of the area in 1965 as part of a broader study of historical crime scenes in Appalachian communities. Her excavations uncovered additional evidence of the cave operation, including personal effects from dozens of victims and fragments of the sophisticated equipment that had been used in the underground facility. Most significantly, Holbrook's survey revealed that the original cave system had been far more extensive than anyone had previously realized. Ground-penetrating radar indicated a network of natural and excavated passages that extended for miles through the mountain, connecting numerous chambers and providing multiple points of access to the surface. The dynamite charges used to seal the cave in 1902 had collapsed only a small portion of this system, leaving the majority of the underground facility intact and potentially accessible. Holbrook's discovery of a partially preserved laboratory in one of the deep chambers provided insight into the sophisticated nature of the medical procedures that had been conducted in the cave. Equipment found at the site included surgical instruments of exceptional quality, chemical apparatus for preservation and embalming, and detailed anatomical charts that indicated a level of medical knowledge far exceeding what would be expected in a remote mountain location. Personal journals found in the laboratory revealed the identity of the operation's medical director as Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, a distant relative of Matthias and Barnabas Ashworth, who had apparently been involved in planning the cave facility from its earliest stages. Dr. Ashworth had been a respected physician in Richmond before his medical license was revoked in 1896, following allegations of illegal experimentation on patients. His journals indicated that he had viewed the cave operation as an opportunity to continue his research without regulatory interference. The journals also revealed that Dr. Ashworth had been experimenting with preservation techniques that went far beyond the simple embalming procedures used for anatomical specimens. His research focused on methods for maintaining biological specimens in a state that would allow for extended study and experimentation, including attempts to preserve neurological tissue for examination of brain function. Most disturbing were Ashworth's notes on experiments that appeared to involve keeping subjects alive during various procedures. These experiments were apparently requested by specific customers who were interested in studying physiological responses under controlled conditions. The sophisticated equipment found in the cave laboratory would have been capable of supporting such research, and Ashworth's notes suggest that these experiments continued until the facility was finally abandoned. Holbrook's final report, submitted to the University of Virginia in 1967, recommended that the entire area be permanently sealed and restricted from public access. Her conclusions indicated that the cave system had been the site of criminal activities on a scale that exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history, and that complete excavation and documentation of all evidence would require resources that were not available for such a project. However, Holbrook's recommendations were never implemented. Shortly after submitting her report, she experienced a severe nervous breakdown that ended her academic career. Colleagues who visited her during her hospitalization reported that she had become obsessed with the idea that the cave operation was still active, and that her research had attracted the attention of its current operators. Holbrook claimed that she had been receiving threatening communications related to her research, and that several break-ins at her university office had resulted in the theft of photographs and documents from the cave survey. She also reported that she had been followed by unidentified individuals during the final weeks of her fieldwork, and that equipment and supplies had been mysteriously moved or destroyed during her excavations. University officials attributed these claims to the psychological stress of working with such disturbing material. But Holbrook's field assistants later confirmed that unusual incidents had occurred throughout the project. Equipment had indeed been tampered with. Several excavation sites had been deliberately filled in during overnight hours, and photographs taken in the deep chambers had been systematically destroyed despite being stored in locked containers. The cave survey project was terminated in early 1967, and all materials related to the research were classified as restricted access. Holbrook spent the final years of her life in a private sanitarium, reportedly continuing to insist that the cave operation was still active and that her research had exposed only a small portion of ongoing criminal activities. The truth about what continues to occur in the depths of Widow's Hollow remains unknown. Federal authorities maintain that the area has been thoroughly investigated and that no evidence of current criminal activity has been found. However, local residents continue to report unexplained phenomena that suggest ongoing human presence in the supposedly abandoned region. Forest Service personnel who patrol the area have noted signs of recent construction work in remote sections of the hollow, including new wooden structures and cleared pathways that appear to serve no recreational or forestry purpose. Hikers and hunters occasionally report hearing sounds of mechanical equipment operating underground, and several have discovered recently excavated areas that suggest continued mining or construction activity. Most disturbing are the reports from individuals who claim to have encountered people in the forest who do not appear to be ordinary hikers or hunters. These individuals are typically described as being unusually pale, dressed in outdated clothing, and carrying equipment that is not appropriate for recreational outdoor activities. When approached, they tend to disappear quickly into the dense forest, often in directions that lead toward the sealed cave entrance. The official position of law enforcement agencies is that these reports represent misidentification of legitimate forest users or reflect the influence of local folklore about the area's disturbing history. However, several sheriff's deputies who have investigated these reports privately express concern that the reports show patterns that are difficult to explain through conventional means. Deputy Marshal Rebecca Hartwell, who has been responsible for law enforcement in the Widow's Hollow area since 1995, acknowledges that the region presents ongoing challenges for public safety. The extensive cave system that was never fully mapped provides numerous opportunities for concealment of illegal activities, and the remote location makes regular surveillance impractical. Hartwell has documented several incidents that suggest possible ongoing criminal activity, including the discovery of recently used campsites in areas that are supposed to be inaccessible, evidence of large-scale food storage in concealed locations, and the occasional recovery of personal items that appear to belong to missing persons from other regions. However, extensive searches of the area have never produced evidence sufficient to justify a major investigation. The terrain is extremely difficult to navigate. The cave system remains partially collapsed and dangerous to enter, and any individuals operating in the area have proven expert at avoiding detection. The question of what really continues to happen in Widow's Hollow may never be fully answered. The original cave operation demonstrated that even in modern times, with improved communications and law enforcement capabilities, it is possible for criminal enterprises of shocking scope to operate undetected in sufficiently remote locations. The mountains of Appalachia contain thousands of similar hollows, many of them equally isolated and equally difficult to monitor. The limestone geology that made Widow's Hollow attractive to the original operation exists throughout the region, providing natural concealment for activities that society would prefer not to acknowledge. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the cave operation was ultimately successful in its primary objective. Despite the arrests and investigations that followed its exposure, the network of customers who had purchased specimens and services from the facility was never fully identified. The demand for anatomical materials and experimental subjects that drove the original operation continues to exist, creating market incentives for similar enterprises to develop in other locations. The legacy of Cordelia Ashworth and the horrors that emerged from Widow's Hollow serves as a reminder that civilization is often much thinner than we would like to believe. In the shadows beyond the reach of law and custom, there remain opportunities for human behavior to descend to levels that most people cannot imagine. The mountains remember everything, and some secrets refuse to remain buried. As you walk through the forests of West Virginia, particularly in those deep hollows where the sun barely penetrates, and the silence seems to press against your eardrums, remember that these ancient mountains have witnessed things that history prefers to forget. The limestone caves that honeycomb the bedrock still echo with whispers from the past, and some of those whispers may not be entirely historical. The careful observer might notice that certain areas seem unusually well maintained for supposedly abandoned locations, or that forest paths appear to receive more traffic than their remote locations would suggest. The occasional discovery of items that clearly do not belong in wilderness settings, medical equipment, chemical supplies, documents bearing recent dates, serves as a reminder that not all of the region's dark history belongs to the past. And if you should hear sounds from beneath the forest floor or catch glimpses of lights moving through the trees where no lights should be, perhaps it would be wise to remember that some investigations are best left to others. The mountains have always kept their secrets, and some of those secrets are protected by guardians who prefer not to be disturbed. The cave at Widow's Hollow may be sealed, but the network it served has proven remarkably adaptable. In a region where missing persons reports often go uninvestigated for weeks, where travelers regularly disappear without explanation, and where the vast wilderness provides perfect concealment for activities that civilization refuses to acknowledge, the work that began with Cordelia Ashworth may very well continue today. The next time you find yourself traveling alone through the remote roads of Appalachia, remember that